Hey everyone, my name is Alan Gongora. I'm managing partner of Langon Law Group. And today we'll be reviewing the mechanics of the so-called Promesa de Compraventa, which roughly translates to the promise of sale. This is the fourth in a 5-part series explaining how to purchase property in Colombia. If you haven't seen our first set of videos, I highly encourage you to go back and watch those videos first. As always, let's get started with some things you should consider as you proceed with this particular set of tutorials. These tutorials are intended to help anyone interested in buying a single-family home or a condo in Colombia. Anyone buying property lots, pre-construction condos, and other types of property will definitely find this tutorial series to be very useful. However, feel free to check out our YouTube channel or our Facebook page because we may have already published additional tutorials that will focus on other types of transactions separately. The difficulty level for these tutorials is basic. This means that you don't need any prior understanding or any specialized knowledge of this topic before watching the video. It should also be fairly user-friendly for anyone interested in buying property in Colombia. As always, keep in mind that these tutorials are only intended to provide general observations and suggestions. Remember that I'm a licensed New York corporate attorney, and while everything you will hear and see has been reviewed and approved by Colombian attorneys, these tutorials are not intended to provide actual legal advice. We highly recommend that you consult your own local attorney to discuss your own specific legal requirement. And with that out of the way, let's get started. In Colombia, it is pretty standard to draft what is typically called a Promesa de Compraventa, which roughly translates to promise of sale. If you've purchased real estate before, this is the equivalent of a standard purchase agreement under local law. And it would normally include things like a description of the property to be purchased, payment terms, legal disclaimers, a payment schedule, liquidated damages clauses, arbitration provisions, and a lot of other types of obligations. Now, if you watched our last video in the series, you know the importance of organizing a solid title analysis. On the one hand, you want to make sure that you can look under the hood and determine if purchasing a specific property is risky. On the other hand, a solid title analysis can also help you negotiate and draft a solid purchase agreement for your transaction. In this way, if your title analysis found that the property has a mortgage, the purchase agreement will have an obligation to pay off that mortgage. If the property has a tax payment past due, the purchase agreement will have an obligation to pay it off. And if the purchase agreement has a lien, the purchase agreement will have an obligation to cancel it, and so on, and so on, and so on. Bottom line, a good purchase agreement incorporates the findings of the title analysis so that you gain maximum protection during the property purchase process. Here's our advice on this. We will be returning to the mechanics of drafting a proper purchase agreement in future tutorials. But for now, just remember that whoever is handling your purchase needs to draft a solid legal document. The purchase agreement needs to protect you under all discernible scenarios while minimizing the risk that the property will be transferred with less than clean title. You do not want to be in a situation where a poorly drafted purchase agreement opens you up to either legal and/or financial risks. It's probably now a good idea to point out one of the biggest differences in how property is purchased in Colombia versus what you might be used to. And I want to go back to our discussion regarding cultural differences back in our title analysis episode. To remind you, the example in that video was as follows. I'm actually originally from New York City. I'm traveling through London and visit you John Smith, that's your name. You offer to sell me your place in London and I decide to buy it. Now, if you've purchased property in the past, you would know that early on, I, the buyer, will be required to put the purchase price into an escrow account. It's only later on when you and I are sitting down across the table from each other at a closing, maybe we're at a lawyer's office or an agent's office, that we actually sign all the legal documentation. It's at that moment that money is instantaneously transferred between accounts. If there's a mortgage, that mortgage is paid off automatically. If there's any back taxes owed, that is also paid off automatically, etc., obviously, etc., etc. The issue is that this process doesn't quite work the same way in Colombia because, for the most part, there is no escrow process in Colombia. Let me repeat that. There is no real escrow process in Colombia. This means that the buyer may need to prepay a bunch of stuff, initial deposits, mortgages, past due tax amounts, etc., weeks, maybe months before signing the deed and getting title to the property. In the real world, a worst case scenario would be as follows. You signed a purchase agreement with the seller. You pay the seller an initial deposit when you both signed the purchase agreement. You then start to pay off all the debts of the property, the mortgages, the back taxes, etc. And then, bizarrely, the seller suddenly just ghosts you and fails to show up at closing. Now, what do? You would then need to go to court to force the transfer of title pursuant to the terms of the purchase agreement. Here's our advice on this. Bottom line, as mentioned elsewhere, Colombia is probably 30 to 40 years behind what you may be used to in terms of the property purchase process. There are certainly holes in the process that a very determined fraudster could exploit to your detriment. This lack of an escrow is definitely something to keep an eye on. However, from experience, I wouldn't worry too much about it. And again, I've made this point in the past. We've been in the market for over a decade. We've handled thousands and thousands of transactions. And I can probably count in one hand the number of times this particular hole in the process has created issues for clients. That's probably enough data points to know that any issues are statistically rare. And remember, you will still have a legally binding contract under Colombian law. At the end of the day, so long as you comply with the purchase agreement and make all your required payments on time, the seller still has a legal obligation to deliver clean title. And remember that the seller has a humongous incentive to cooperate throughout the property purchase process. And remember, for most transactions, that seller only gets the bulk of their payment at closing, which means that the seller has every incentive to transfer title at the end of the process. Once you have finalized the draft of the purchase agreement, it is time to figure out the mechanics of how to sign the purchase agreement and pay your earnest money deposit. Now, the actual mechanics and chronology may vary quite a bit depending on the attorney you're going to use, the actual deal terms, the specific strategy involved. I'm just going to describe the way our local law firm may handle a typical transaction so that you can get a better sense of how your own transaction may proceed. Here we go. We may, for example, schedule the execution of the purchase agreement on a Friday, which means that our team might ask you to initiate the transfer of funds to Colombia that very Monday. In other words, 5 days prior. This way, your funds arrive in Colombia Monday/Tuesday. Our team would draft the documentation necessary to nationalize your funds Tuesday/Wednesday. Your funds will be released, let's say Wednesday/Thursday, which means you will have funds available to pay your earnest money deposit by that Friday, which is typically 10 to 30% of the purchase price. And then the following Monday, you may need to start paying off any liabilities tied to the property, mortgages, back taxes, liens, etc. Now, we will be looking into the basics of transferring funds in and out of Colombia in a separate tutorial. For now, I want to emphasize how important it is for you to transfer funds into the country correctly. I always tell clients the same thing. There are two areas of the law that always give me heartburn. The first is employment law. Colombia is a very paternalistic place, particularly for legal culture. It's very pro-employee. And the second is the transfer of funds in and out of the country. This area of the law is very professionalized. Part of the reason is that places like the US, Europe are always pushing Colombia to limit money laundering. It's not really rocket science, but you definitely want to do this stuff correctly. Here's our advice on this. Please follow the advice of your local legal service provider. Make sure you prioritize the registration of your investment. It's probably just as important as getting clean title to your new property. Keep in mind that by signing the purchase agreement, both you and the seller will have very specific legal obligations going forward. For the seller, the most important obligations have to do with cleaning up the property title. So for example, they would need to cancel any liens on the property. They may also need to clarify any discrepancies in the property boundaries. The actual legal obligations will vary depending on the property involved. Once your lawyer confirms that all relevant obligations have been met, a closing is scheduled at a local notary. It's at this point that a good, reputable attorney will shine. Prior to closing, they will work with the local notary to draft a solid deed and related documentation that transfers clean title. During closing, they will review all the relevant documentations again to ensure that clean title remains through execution. You will then sign the relevant documentation and receive keys from seller, and then you will receive title in your name several weeks later. And that's the end of our 4th episode in this series. We encourage you to watch the remaining episodes so you can gain additional insight into the property purchase process in Colombia. We hope that the information we presented was both useful and practical. For myself and the rest of our team in Colombia, thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit subscribe and hit the bell to get the latest content from our local law firm in Colombia.